What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. History podcast. Okay, it is now time to dive into some of the details of the U.S. Constitution. In this episode, I'm going to go over the major points of contention that were discussed, argued, fought over during the Constitutional Convention. I'm going to talk about how some of those were resolved, and I'm going to talk about the major portions of the Constitution in broad strokes. I'm going to do it in a sort of basic way in this episode because I'm going to dig much more into the details in the next three. So I think you can think of this episode as kind of a summary of the major stuff about the Constitution that you would want to know, that I think most everyone, I would hope, would want to know. And then in the following three episodes, I'm going to dive more into the details about how those things came about. So this would be a good primer, I think, for the next three episodes, or you can take it as a standalone if you're not that interested in the details. You do you. But before I get into all that, I'd like to remind you to please like and subscribe. As I've said many times before, it really does help people find the podcast or the YouTube channel. And if you enjoy listening to all this stuff and getting the lowdown on all this cool history information that maybe you didn't know before you started listening, that would make it much easier for me to keep doing this. So if you're enjoying the show and you'd like me to keep doing it, getting people to like and subscribe, recommending it to your family or friends or whoever, it's the best way to do that. And I really, truly do appreciate those of you that have liked and subscribed, that have even recommended the show to friends or family. That's so good of you, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to start this episode, as I always do, by giving you a question to think about as I'm going through this information, and also the resources that I use to put this episode together. I'll start with the books that I use to put together the episode. First off, there's The American Pageant, AP US History textbook that I've mentioned in every episode. Same with Give Me Liberty, another AP US History textbook that I've mentioned in every episode. The Glorious Cause, The American Revolution 1763 to 1789 by Robert Middlecoff. And then there is Plain Honest Men, The Making of the American Constitution by Richard Beeman. And finally, Miracle at Philadelphia, The Story of the Constitutional Convention, May to September 1787 by Catherine Drinker Bowen. And the question that you're going to want to think about as I'm going through the broad strokes of the Constitution: how did the Constitutional Convention seek to fix the problems of government under the Articles, and what were the key points of debate when constructing the Constitution? I'll repeat that. How did the Constitutional Convention seek to fix the problems of government under the Articles of Confederation? And what were the key points of debate when constructing the Constitution? So keep that in mind as we go along here. It'll help you, I think, to remember and organize the information. In the last episode, I discussed how it was that the Constitutional Convention came to be. What were the last straws, if you will, that finally pushed various leaders of the Articles of Confederation government, the Confederation Congress, and of some of the states as well to say, okay, enough is enough. We got to do something here. This isn't working. By 1786-87, you'd had the issues of Shays' Rebellion, the continued problems with paying off the debt, all the various foreign threats to the United States, plus the threats of Native Americans on the frontier. And you had the Annapolis Convention, which met in the late summer, fall of 1786. And that set the table for the Constitutional Convention, which met in the spring and summer of 1787. So now I'm going to get into exactly what took place there. So first of all, who went? As you probably already know, it was white men. And that's it. Certainly not anywhere close to what we would today call a diverse room of people. However, not all of these white men, most of whom were pretty well off financially, were coming from the same geographical place. Certainly, they were coming from these 13 different states, and the cultures and the economies of these states had a reasonably significant impact on the way that these guys looked at the world. As I said, there were 55 ultimately who attended at some point during the Constitutional Convention. Of the 55, 34 had some kind of legal training. Maybe they weren't lawyers per se, but they'd had some kind of legal training at some point. There were 21 actual attorneys. 18 were planters. And I don't just mean farmers, I mean people that had plantations, which is a little bit different than just being any kind of farmer at all. Certainly different than being, say, a subsistence farmer who's just growing food to feed his family and maybe sell a little bit extra on the side. The plantation owners are the ones that have a lot of land, probably slaves, and they're probably only concentrating on one crop. 19 of the 55 who attended were slave owners. 8 of the 55 were specifically lawyers who worked in the realm of commerce. They were either merchants themselves, or they gave legal advice to merchants, or maybe some combination of both of those things. So there is a little bit of diversity in the sense that they're not all lawyers, they're not all from the same part of the country, and they have slightly different interests going in. Of course, in this context, you take the word diversity with not a grain of salt, but a gigantic boulder of salt, because it's certainly not what we would see as diverse today, and there were a lot of groups there not represented at all. The biggest point of contention over the course of the Constitutional Convention, and there were a number, but the biggest one, the one that almost wrecked the convention, was how to reconcile the precedent of equal representation in the legislature, in the national government, because under the Articles of Confederation, every state had one vote for what the legislature of the Articles government, the Confederation Congress, would do. And what Madison and some of those around him pushed really hard was the idea that there would be now proportional representation, not equal representation, that different states would have different amounts of representation in the legislature based on either population or wealth, were the two gauges most commonly referenced to determine how the proportionality would be decided. And that is what's known as the Virginia Plan. The representatives basically confronted the issue straight away, and it took them a while to work it out. And like I said, it nearly did wreck the convention. So though the arguments over proportional representation were big and ugly, they were more or less resolved by the time you get to the middle of July, about July 15th. There'd been a vote and things got sorted out. There were also big arguments about the powers of the legislature, what exactly it could do, and specifically what the federal government in general could do vis-a-vis the states and their own powers and authorities. One of the things, for example, that Madison had pushed really hard that obviously did not get included because it's not a thing today, is the idea that the national government, the federal government, could veto or nullify laws put together by the states. Of course, that would have been very tricky to work out logistically, right? And it was something that a lot of the representatives pushed back hard enough that it just didn't get included. And it's this notion of the balance between what the national government can do and what the states can do that we today call federalism. People who were meeting at the convention just knew that the weakness of the national government was not tenable, and that if they were going to have a country that worked as a whole, they'd have to have a more powerful national government that could have a lot of authority over the states and weigh in on disputes between them and resolve them. There were also really intense disputes and arguments over the powers, the election, and the general nature of the executive branch and its role relative to the legislature. What do I mean by that? I mean that they argued about how the executive would be chosen, which citizens would have the right to vote for the executive or choose the executive. Would the executive even be a single person, or would it be a committee of people? How long would the executive serve? Would the executive have the possibility of re-election? And then what were the powers that the executive would have over the other branches or just onto itself? As you've probably heard, there were arguments over slavery as well, although probably a little different than what you've heard, because the morality of slavery was never really brought up. And that's not to say that there weren't people at the convention who thought slavery was immoral. There very much were people at the convention who thought slavery was immoral and would have liked to get rid of it if they could. But everyone there on some level understood that this was a tenuous situation, that it was delicate, it was fragile, and that if they were going to work something out that was going to be acceptable to a large number of people in the state legislatures, slavery was not something they were probably going to be able to touch, because slavery was too important to some people in some of the states to be messed around with in any significant way. The things that they did get into the details of pretty substantially were things like how much representation should be accorded to slaves when it came to the proportional representation that each state gets in the national legislature. And there were also questions about how long importation of slaves from outside of the United States would be allowed, as well as what the property status of slaves would be, how that would work from a legal standpoint. And it's one of these things that, again, to our modern sensibilities, it seems really callous. And I think even by the standards of that day, there were a lot of people who would look at that as callous. To talk about human beings and their status as property, for most of us, I wish it were all of us, it's offensive and degrading. And that was the institution of slavery for as long as it ever existed. It's maybe the ugliest thing that humanity's ever done, but these were people who were talking about it in context of trying to keep their government together, and they knew that this was a non-starter, totally out of bounds for some of the people that they would have to appeal to try to make the Union work. So they talked about it in legalistic, practical terms, and not in moral terms, and it's something that is difficult to read about. Another key issue of this debate was democracy itself. And I have said in this episode and in a few others that a consistent concern of a lot of the people who were meeting at the Constitutional Convention, as well as people in the elite classes in many of the states, was what they saw as too much democracy. I described in some of the episodes the way in which the period between the beginning of the Revolutionary War and the Constitutional Convention saw a really dramatic increase in the amount of democratic participation in governments at the state level, in the national government to some degree, and just more and more people thinking that they had a right to have a voice in things. You had more people from more diverse economic backgrounds, not just the upper classes, the social betters, as they thought of it in those days, aspiring to public office and aspiring to choose people for public office, to vote for them. And some people, a lot of the members of the Constitutional Convention, saw this as going too far. They thought that too many people had gotten a sense that they had a say in the government, and that wasn't really acceptable to them. There are a lot of ways in which historians will talk about the Constitutional Convention as a conservative political event that sought to reassert the old order, socially and politically. That argument makes sense to me because if you look at what the Constitutional Convention produced, it was a document and a form of government that was a lot less inclusive of average people. There are any number of ways that you can see evidence of that. There's the fact that the Senate was only supposed to draw from, if you look at the debates especially, within the Constitutional Convention, the Senate was only supposed to be people from the upper classes. That the senators themselves would be chosen by the state legislators and not by the voters. That the president would be chosen by the Electoral College, this group that would get together and vote however they wanted to vote, regardless of what the people wanted, because especially in the first few presidential elections, there was almost no popular input. No input from just average folks about who the president would be. The electors got together and they chose the person based on what they thought was best. And they were chosen themselves by state legislatures, not by the people. So there's a lot of separation between who is in charge at the federal level, who is governing, and the people that they are representing. There's just not a lot of democracy there, and that was because the guys at the Constitutional Convention, for the most part, looked at things like Shays' Rebellion and looked at various other versions of popular uprisings, maybe not as dramatic as Shays' Rebellion, but things that happened where the people, the average people, tried to assert their authority over their betters. They saw that guys like Robert Morris and George Washington and Governor Morris and James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton, and they thought, this is too much. We need to rein this back in. Both because these people are going to do things that are reckless, because this whole process of choosing their government and choosing the people who are in the government is new to them, and a lot of them are not ready for that responsibility yet. And because, what if they start coming after our money? And there were people that talked about, in many different states, Thomas Paine was one of them, this idea that there needed to be more equal distribution of property. It wasn't a good thing to have so much property in the hands of so few people. It's not that hard to find evidence of people saying things like that in the revolutionary and post-revolutionary period. So, in many ways, the Constitutional Convention is as it is called in, for instance, the American Pageant, that textbook, it's called a conservative triumph. And there's a reason for that. So there were questions about democracy that had to be resolved, about representation in the legislature, about the authority of the executive, about slavery, though the word slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution. And though there are these big disagreements, because the delegates come from more or less the same class, there are similar interests that they have. And the biggest arguments are typically between people from small states and people from larger states, and by that I mean population, not land area, because the big debate is, okay, how much representation and authority are you going to give the smaller states versus how much to the big states. But in terms of the social order, economic security, protection of property, curbing excessive democracy, foreign policy, admission of new states, and the ability to amend the Constitution later on, those were things that the delegates mostly agreed with each other on. I mean, there were still debates about those things, and they had to work those things out in the process. And I'll get into more of that in the later episodes if you're really interested. But those were issues that people at the Constitutional Convention were able to find more common ground than uncommon ground, I think is the way that I would put it. So as I said, that is a very big picture, 30,000-foot view explanation of the disagreements and the arguments and the major points of contention that were resolved at the Constitutional Convention. If you want to have a more detailed understanding of what the arguments were at the Constitutional Convention, how they got resolved, who was making them, and what the final product looked like, I would strongly recommend that you tune in to the next 3 episodes after this one, where I will dive in a lot more deeply to the process that made the Constitution. I just want to give a broad overview in this episode for anybody who's just interested in the big picture stuff. And for those of you that want to know more, I'd strongly recommend that you listen to the next 3 episodes. Of course, that sounds a little biased coming from the host, but you will get a much more detailed explanation if you do tune in to those. I'm going to jump now to the ratification process. So Article 7 of the Constitution dictated that ratification of the conventions of 9 states, and that's a direct quote, ratification of the conventions of 9 states would mean that it was then the law of the land. So the organizers of the Constitutional Convention and those who were strongest behind it, and not everybody who attended signed on to the Constitution. In fact, quite a few of them did not. I will get into that in the next set of episodes. But those who did sign on to it mostly pushed to have it ratified. There's actually one or two that didn't push to have it ratified, but those who wanted the Constitution ratified, the Federalists, as they were called, because they wanted a stronger federal government, were attempting to get 9 of the 13 states to ratify the Constitution, thus making the Constitution the law of the land. Ideally, they wanted all 13 to sign on, but their goal in the immediate term was to get 9 of the 13 to sign on, and certainly some states carried more weight than others. For example, Virginia carried a lot more weight than, say, Delaware. Not trying to hate on Delaware. Love you people from Delaware. But in those days, and I think to some degree now, Delaware just didn't carry as much influence as the state of Virginia did. States like Virginia, like New York, like Pennsylvania, those were the states that the Federalists, who wanted the Constitution to be ratified, were really pushing to make sure ratified the Constitution. The Constitution was introduced to the Articles Congress, the Confederation Congress, on September 20th of 1787. Richard Henry Lee, who is from Virginia and was an opponent of ratification, proposed amending it at that time immediately, and then forwarding it to the states after it had been amended. His proposal failed, fortunately for those who wanted to ratify the Constitution, because that would have made the process endlessly more messy. Just imagine trying to stick a whole bunch of amendments onto the Constitution from the Articles of Confederation Congress with all the different states putting their input into it. The more people have input on something, the messier it gets to make it happen. It's like I explained when I talked about ratifying the Articles of Confederation. I mean, if you've ever been in a room and tried to get 5 people to agree what to put on a pizza, that's a bitch. Trying to get the whole national government rejiggered and made into something much stronger that, as I've mentioned a number of times now, a lot of people were very nervous about, that would have been a tall, if not impossible, order to accomplish. So Lee's proposal to add amendments failed, and Congress sent the Constitution onto the states without any recommendation one way or the other. They didn't say, we the Congress support this Constitution. They didn't say, we're against it. They just sent it on to the states and let them make their own decisions, which is, from the perspective of the Federalists like Madison, like Ben Franklin, like George Washington, that's kind of the best case scenario. Just send it on, let the states make up their minds. We'll have our people in those states push the leaders of the states to ratify the Constitution. That's the best we think we can do. Most in Congress approved of the Constitution, actually. There were some very, very vocal opponents, like Richard Henry Lee, but most of them did approve. 18 of the Confederation Congress representatives were delegates to the convention. So that definitely gave the Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, an edge that was meaningful. But they did not want Congress to put its thumb on the scale. Even the supporters, the Federalists, did not want Congress to put its thumb on the scale. They thought that that would be counterproductive. They thought that that might engender greater opposition to the Constitution than anything that it might do to get people to vote in favor of it. So they were happy to kind of have the Confederation Congress back off and not make an endorsement one way or the other. Delaware, speaking of Delaware, acted rapidly. After receiving Congress's message, its legislature called a special election and ratified the Constitution unanimously. Everybody who voted on it said, yes, we want this, on December 7th of 1787. So, yeah, Delaware didn't carry the weight that New York or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or Virginia did, but the fact that Delaware was willing to step up and go ahead and ratify the thing pretty quickly was meaningful, and Delaware will forever get the credit of being the first state to ratify the new Constitution. So, kind of an interesting trivia question if you're ever doing like bar trivia or whatever, to know that Delaware was the first state to ratify the Constitution. Delaware was motivated in no small part to ratify it quickly by what its neighbors would do, in particular Pennsylvania and New York. Pennsylvania Federalists got organized really well, and they out-organized the Anti-Federalist opposition to the Constitution. And in the Pennsylvania legislature, those legislators voted 2-1 to ratify the Constitution on December 12th of 1787. So just 5 days after Delaware ratified the Constitution, Pennsylvania did as well. I think that's a big part of the reason why Pennsylvania refers to itself, its state ID or nickname or whatever, is the Keystone State, as in the key cog in the machine of a bridge. That's what a keystone is. And I think Delaware being the first big populous state to ratify the Constitution has something to do with that. I'm not positive, but I think that's the case. I should probably ask my sister and my brother-in-law, since they both live there and he grew up there. New Jersey also ratified the Constitution unanimously on January 2nd of 1788. And this momentum, having 3 states ratify the Constitution in about the space of a month, carried on to other states. Georgia and Connecticut ratified within another month. Massachusetts was the first really difficult vote because you had people like Sam Adams there and John Hancock who were at the very least ambivalent toward the Constitution because they were concerned, as I said earlier, about civil liberties and about states' rights. They were afraid that a new, stronger national government would overwhelm the states and the individual rights of citizens and be kind of a, as I've suggested before, Parliament 2.0, King George III 2.0, whatever. They were concerned about the tyranny of a much stronger national government. But those who were in favor of ratifying the Constitution, the Federalists in Massachusetts, coaxed Hancock and Sam Adams to support ratification, and Massachusetts recommended, as a part of its ratification process, amendments to the Constitution that would be added later on. And they agreed to ratify the Constitution first and push for the amendments afterward, which took some faith on their part, certainly, because when you're negotiating and when you're concerned about something, you don't want to give up the leverage you have necessarily in order to make a deal. And that's kind of what they did by agreeing to the Anti-Federalists. They sort of gave up their leverage by agreeing to ratify the Constitution before getting the amendments they wanted. It was an act of faith on the part of those Anti-Federalists who were nervous about the new Constitution, but it was really important for getting the thing ratified, ultimately. Maryland, New Hampshire, South Carolina, all ratified after Massachusetts by June of 1788. And that's when you get to the really tough fight of Virginia. And as I've sort of alluded to now, Virginia was a big deal because a lot of the most prominent leaders of the Revolution were from Virginia. Obviously George Washington, obviously Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, those kinds of folks. Some of the loudest voices that were opposed to ratification were from Virginia. Patrick Henry had not really changed his opinion. He still thought this was a bad idea. He was against giving a new national government a lot more power, and he was kind of the Cicero of his time. He was this magnificent orator that people used to listen to in rapture as he would work his lyrical, rhetorical magic. And someone like James Madison, who was a great thinker and a phenomenal writer, and again, if you're going to pick out one person who gets the lion's share of the credit for the Constitution, it's probably him. He was no great public speaker, Madison, like Patrick Henry was. And the Federalists, who wanted the Constitution ratified, were very nervous about how things would go in Virginia, given the opposition that they were facing. It was a close vote, but Virginia did ratify the Constitution despite opposition from some heavy hitters. That obstacle having been overcome made ratification in the other very difficult state, New York, a lot easier. Virginia ratified by the end of June of 1788, and then New York ratified in July, in no small part because of the efforts of John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton in writing and publishing anonymously the Federalist Papers, which collectively gave different reasons for ratifying the Constitution. And the Federalist Papers have become very, very important since then. You can see references to them in a lot of Supreme Court cases, by way of example, for interpreting what the guys who wrote the Constitution and who amended it wanted it to mean or to say. Because the Constitution itself is very short, by the way. If you sat down and read it, probably would take you like 2 hours at the most. That's being a little generous, I think. So it's the basis of this gigantic now federal government that we have, and there's constantly been this question, especially in the 20th century, of what did these guys who wrote this thing hundreds of years ago now, what did they mean? And the Federalist Papers are often referred to as some of the best explanations for what they did mean because they were put forward by guys who really wanted to see the Constitution ratified, 2 of whom, Madison and Alexander Hamilton, were at the Constitutional Convention. So the Federalist Papers advocate aggressively for the Constitution's ratification. I don't know, and I'm not sure that anybody does, how much effect they actually had. Like, did they change people's minds? I'm not really sure. But ultimately, New York did ratify the Constitution by July of 1788. And at that point, you've got 11 of the 13 states having ratified it. There were 2, obviously, then that didn't, North Carolina and Rhode Island, and they really lagged behind the other states. And if you know something about North Carolina and Rhode Island's characters as states, who was in charge there, why they were settled, I have described in previous episodes where I talked about colonial North Carolina and colonial Rhode Island. I've described them as places that people went who didn't like or respect elite figures of authority. In the case of North Carolina, it was people escaping the wealthy planter classes from Virginia and South Carolina. And in the case of Rhode Island, it was people mostly escaping the onerous burden of church leaders, Puritans. And so both states kind of have this tradition of, fuck you, you can't tell me what to do. And that's, I think, a good explainer of why they were so much later to ratify the Constitution than the other states. As I said, Rhode Island didn't even send any delegates to the Constitutional Convention. That's how invested Rhode Island was in maintaining its autonomy. I should say I sort of skipped over this. Edmund Randolph, who became the first Attorney General under George Washington and who was a representative at the Constitutional Convention and whose family was one of the great planter aristocrat families of Virginia, his endorsement in the debate over ratifying the Constitution in Virginia is what helped convince a number of Virginia delegates who were on the fence about ratifying the Constitution to go ahead and do it, as did George Washington's presence and influence. Both of those guys, they carried a lot of weight, and there is a, I think, pretty convincing argument to be made that without the assistance and the advocacy of George Washington and Edmund Randolph, the Constitution is not ratified in Virginia. I find that pretty convincing. And in New York, of course, the Federalist Papers, as I said. So you have a ratified Constitution, although North Carolina doesn't ratify it until November of 1789, which is over a year after New York, the last state of the original 11 to do it, ratifies it. And Rhode Island doesn't ratify it until May of 1790. Once that's done, everybody's in. And, prior to that, the federal government is being formed, and George Washington has been elected president by the Electoral College, and we have a new government, the government that we still have today, which is pretty remarkable that it has lasted that long. I think it's fair to say that even the most optimistic souls at the Constitutional Convention did not expect that centuries into the future, what they designed, the government they put together, would be in effect in the United States. But here we are. As always, I want to thank you guys for listening. I really appreciate your time and attention. I know it's precious. If you have any questions or comments or advice, I'd love to hear it. You can reach out to me at howthehelldowwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can leave me a voicemail or a text message at area code 951-525-5536. Please like and subscribe if you have not done so already. I would really appreciate it, and it would really help the show. Thanks very much, and I will be back next time with a much deeper dive over the course of about 3 episodes into the Constitution, how it was created, how it was structured, and all that good stuff. Thanks again, take care, and I will catch you next time.